Look at your hand for a second. The person sitting next to you on the train. Someone scrolling their phone across the world in Shanghai or Mumbai or Lagos. You share 99.9% of your DNA with them. Genetically, you're almost identical. Same species, same ancestors, same evolutionary journey that nearly ended 900,000 years ago when barely 1,280 humans clung to survival. So here's the question that keeps historians and anthropologists awake at night. If we're all basically the same, why did we build such radically different civilizations? Why did Europeans develop feudal kingdoms with stone castles, while Chinese emperors ruled through centralized bureaucracies spanning thousands of miles? Why did Asian societies preserve ancient philosophical traditions for millennia, while European thought went through dramatic revolutions every few centuries? Why did one continent develop gunpowder for fireworks and celebration, while another used it to conquer the world? These aren't small differences. We're talking about fundamentally distinct ways of organizing society, understanding reality, expressing spirituality, and relating to nature. Same species, same brain capacity, wildly different results. If you're using this to fall asleep, perfect. That's exactly why I make these. So maybe subscribe and tell me where you're watching from and what time it is. I read the comments and it's fascinating. Tokyo at sunrise, London at midnight, someone in Arizona at 3 a.m. wondering why they can't sleep. All of you, everywhere, descendants of the same tiny group that refused to die out. Picture this. It's around 50,000 years ago. Modern humans have survived the bottleneck, spread across Africa, and now they're on the move. Small groups are pushing into new territories, following coastlines, tracking animal herds, searching for better hunting grounds. Some head northwest into Europe, others move east toward Asia. They're the same people, same tools, same languages, same beliefs, same everything. Fast forward to 1200 AD. In Europe, you'd find scattered kingdoms constantly at war with each other, stone fortresses dotting the landscape, feudal lords controlling small territories, the Catholic Church wielding enormous power but competing with secular rulers, knowledge locked away in monasteries, most people living short, brutal lives working land they'd never own. Meanwhile, in China, you'd witness something completely different. A unified empire stretching from the Pacific Ocean to the edge of Central Asia. Millions of people connected by canals and roads, paying taxes to a centralized government. Civil servants chosen through competitive examinations testing knowledge of ancient texts. Massive cities with populations that wouldn't be matched in Europe for centuries. Technologies that wouldn't reach the West for hundreds of years. Same humans, different worlds. Or consider this. In medieval Europe, nature was often seen as something to be conquered, tamed, dominated. Wild forests were dangerous places filled with threats. The biblical mandate was clear: subdue the earth, bend it to human will. In Japan during the same period, nature was revered as sacred. Mountains housed spirits. Rivers had souls. The goal wasn't domination, but harmony. Living with nature, not against it. Shinto shrines built to honor trees that had stood for centuries. How does this happen? How do people with identical brains, identical creative potential, identical capacity for complex thought end up viewing the world through such different lenses? For a long time, people explain these differences with racism, with pseudoscientific theories about superior and inferior races. We know now that's complete nonsense. The genetic differences between a person from Stockholm and someone from Seoul are trivial, meaningless. We're talking about variations in maybe a few thousand genes out of over 20,000. The real answer is simultaneously simpler and more fascinating. It comes down to three things: geography, climate, and an enormous amount of random chance. The landscapes our ancestors walked into weren't blank slates. Europe and Asia presented radically different challenges and opportunities. Mountains ran in different directions, rivers flowed through different terrains, growing seasons varied by months, available plants and animals for domestication weren't the same. The diseases, the rainfall patterns, the mineral resources, everything was different. And these differences, compounded over thousands of years, pushed human societies down divergent evolutionary paths. Not genetic evolution, but cultural evolution. Different solutions to different problems, different technologies for different environments, different philosophies emerging from different lived experiences. The fascinating part. None of it was inevitable. Change a few variables, shift a mountain range, alter some rainfall patterns, and the entire story of human civilization would be completely different. Maybe Chinese explorers would have colonized Europe. Maybe democracy would have been invented in India instead of Greece. Maybe the Industrial Revolution would have started in Japan. We're about to explore one of history's greatest mysteries, not through the tired lens of racial superiority or cultural supremacy, but through the actual mechanisms that shaped human societies, the invisible hand of geography, the relentless pressure of climate, the agricultural revolution that changed everything, the power of language to shape thought itself, the role of philosophy and religion in organizing massive populations, the different paths technology took when solving similar problems. This is the story of how we became different while remaining fundamentally the same, how the landscape shaped the mind, how climate sculpted culture, how random chance combined with human ingenuity created the diverse, fascinating tapestry of civilizations we inherited. It's a story written in mountains and monsoons, in wheat fields and rice paddies, in the direction rivers flow and the animals that happen to live nearby. And it all started when a small group of humans, survivors of the greatest crisis our species ever faced, began walking in different directions into an unknown world. Before there was Europe and Asia, before there were separate populations developing in isolation, before the differences that would eventually distinguish continental groups, there was just one people, one small population, all living in Africa, all sharing the same ancestors, all carrying the same genetic legacy from the bottleneck that had nearly destroyed them. Around 70,000 years ago, something extraordinary happened. A group of humans, maybe just a few hundred individuals, made a decision that would change the course of our species forever. They left Africa. Now, this wasn't the first time humans had ventured beyond their homeland. There had been earlier attempts, smaller migrations that left traces in the fossil record. But those earlier pioneers had failed. They'd established temporary footholds in the Middle East and beyond, but their populations hadn't lasted. They'd been wiped out by climate fluctuations, outcompeted by local populations, or simply absorbed back into African groups. But this time was different. The descendants of these particular migrants wouldn't just survive, they would eventually populate the entire planet. What drove them to leave? We don't know for certain. Maybe it was population pressure, too many people competing for too few resources in their East African homeland. Maybe it was curiosity, that uniquely human impulse to see what lies beyond the horizon. Maybe it was desperation, fleeing from drought or conflict or disease. Or maybe it was simply opportunity. Around 70,000 years ago, sea levels were lower than they are today. The narrow strait between Africa and the Arabian Peninsula, normally a significant water barrier, had narrowed to just a few kilometres. On a clear day you could stand on the African shore and see the Arabian coast. You could imagine walking there. And so some people did. They didn't know they were making history. They weren't thinking about populating new continents or founding new civilizations. They were just moving, following game animals, searching for better resources, maybe fleeing enemies or seeking allies. But with each step away from Africa, they were beginning a journey that would reshape human evolution. The initial migration probably happened in waves, not all at once. Small groups crossing when conditions were favourable, establishing camps on the Arabian side, then either returning or pushing further. Eventually some groups stopped returning. They found territories they liked, resources they could exploit. They settled, and then they kept moving. Within just a few thousand years, which is remarkably fast in evolutionary terms, these migrants had spread along the coastlines of the Arabian Peninsula and into South Asia. They weren't travelling inland yet. The interior regions were still too harsh, too dry, filled with deserts and mountains that would have been deadly to small groups with limited technology. Instead, they followed the coasts. This is what anthropologists call the coastal migration hypothesis. These early migrants stayed near the ocean, exploiting marine resources, following shorelines that gave them reliable access to food and water. Archaeological sites from this period show evidence of shellfish consumption, fish bones, the remnants of a maritime economy that sustained human expansion. But here's where the story splits. Somewhere in South Asia, maybe around what is now Pakistan or India, the single migration stream divided into two major branches. It was a crossroads, a decision point. Some groups turned northwest, following coastlines and river valleys toward the Middle East and eventually Europe. Others turned east, heading along the southern coastlines of Asia towards Southeast Asia, China, and eventually beyond. This was the moment when the European and Asian populations began their separate journeys. But remember, at this point, they were still the same people, genetically identical, culturally similar, speaking related languages, using the same technologies. They weren't choosing different destinies, they were just going in different directions. The groups heading toward Europe found a world in transition. Ice Age conditions were fluctuating. Massive glaciers covered northern regions. Steppes and grasslands dominated areas that are now forests. And scattered across this landscape were Neanderthals, those robust, cold-adapted humans who had been living in Europe for hundreds of thousands of years. The newcomers weren't dominant, they weren't superior, they were outsiders entering someone else's territory. The archaeological record shows they initially occupied marginal areas, coastal regions and river valleys that Neanderthals hadn't fully exploited. They were refugees, really, climate migrants trying to establish themselves in an already occupied land. The groups heading east encountered different challenges: warmer climates, dense forests in some regions, open grasslands in others, different animals, different plants. And eventually they would encounter Denisovans, those mysterious eastern relatives who had adapted to Asian environments over hundreds of millennia. Both groups were small. Genetic analysis suggests the founding population heading toward Europe might have numbered just a few hundred individuals. The eastern group was probably similar in size. These weren't massive migrations. They were tiny bands of pioneers, family groups connected by kinship, carrying everything they owned, venturing into unknown territories with no guarantee of survival. And this is where genetics begins to tell us something crucial about why Europeans and Asians would eventually develop differently. When you have small founding populations, you get what geneticists call founder effects and population bottlenecks. Not every gene variant from the original African population makes it into the migrating groups. It's like pouring a bag of mixed marbles through a narrow funnel. Some colours make it through, others don't, just by random chance. This means the European-bound group and the Asian-bound group, despite starting from the same source population, were already carrying slightly different subsets of human genetic variation. Not major differences, not different species, but subtle variations that would become more pronounced over time. Then came isolation. This is the key. For tens of thousands of years, these two populations were almost completely separated from each other. The European group was thousands of miles to the west, adapting to Ice Age conditions, interbreeding with Neanderthals, developing their own survival strategies. The Asian group was thousands of miles to the east, adapting to completely different environments, interbreeding with Denisovans in some regions, facing their own unique challenges. There was no internet, no trade routes connecting distant continents, no way for innovations developed in one population to quickly spread to the other. If a European group figured out a better way to hunt woolly mammoths, that knowledge stayed in Europe. If an Asian group developed new fishing techniques, those techniques stayed in Asia. Picture the world they inhabited. No cities, no countries, no borders or customs checkpoints, just endless wilderness. Forests stretching from horizon to horizon, grasslands where herds of animals roamed in numbers that would be unimaginable today, mountains that had never known human footsteps, rivers that flowed untouched by human hands, and scattered across this vast emptiness, tiny groups of humans, maybe 30 people here, 50 people there, separated by hundreds of miles, living their entire lives without ever meeting strangers, passing down knowledge through oral tradition, teaching children the survival skills that had kept their ancestors alive since the Great Bottleneck. They were still connected in one sense. They were all human, all capable of interbreeding if they ever met, all sharing the same basic cognitive abilities, the same capacity for language and culture and innovation. A child born in Europe and raised in Asia would have been indistinguishable from a child born in Asia. The differences weren't genetic in any fundamental sense, not yet. But isolation was beginning its slow work. Each generation, each population faced slightly different selection pressures. European groups were dealing with cold, with seasonal extremes, with large, dangerous animals. Natural selection favoured traits that helped with those challenges. Asian groups faced their own pressures, different climates, different resources, different survival problems. Natural selection responded accordingly, and slowly, imperceptibly, over thousands of generations, the two populations began to drift apart. Not in their fundamental humanity, not in their basic capabilities, but in subtle frequencies of gene variants, in minor physical adaptations, in the cultural solutions they developed to environmental challenges. This wasn't planned. Nobody was trying to create different populations. It was simply what happens when you take one group and split it into two, then let those two groups adapt to different environments for 50,000 years without significant contact. But here's what's remarkable. Despite this isolation, despite adapting to radically different environments on opposite sides of the planet, Europeans and Asians remained fundamentally the same. One species, one human family, separated by geography but united by heritage. Every person in Europe carried genes that had originated in Africa. Every person in Asia descended from those same African ancestors. They were cousins, separated by distance and time, but cousins nonetheless. And the differences they would develop, the variations in appearance and culture and language that would eventually distinguish them, all of that was still mostly in the future. For now, they were just humans, trying to survive, trying to raise their children, trying to pass on the knowledge that would keep their lineage alive for one more generation. They didn't know they were participating in one of the greatest experiments in human evolution. They were just living, but in living, in adapting, in surviving across two vast continents, they were setting the stage for all the diversity that would follow. The age of unity was ending. The age of differentiation was beginning, and the world would never be the same. So here's the thing nobody tells you about human civilization. Geography isn't just a backdrop. It's not just where the story happens. Geography is the story. It's the invisible hand that shaped every empire, every innovation, every cultural difference we see today between Europe and Asia. And it all comes down to one deceptively simple fact: the direction of the land. Picture a map of Eurasia. Now imagine you're a farmer with a revolutionary new crop, say wheat, 10,000 years ago. You're standing somewhere in the Fertile Crescent, modern-day Iraq, and you want to spread this incredible discovery to other communities. If you head west toward Europe, you're travelling along roughly the same latitude. Same day length, same seasonal patterns, same temperature ranges. Your wheat will grow just fine in Greece, in Italy, in Spain. The climate is similar enough that your farming techniques transfer directly. You're moving along what geographer Jared Diamond called the east-west axis. But if you head east into Asia, or south into Africa, you hit a wall. Not a physical wall, but something just as effective. Climate zones. You're crossing latitudes now, moving through radically different environments. Those wheat varieties that worked perfectly in the Fertile Crescent suddenly fail in the monsoon climates of India. The growing seasons are all wrong. The rainfall patterns don't match. The temperatures swing wildly between extremes your crops can't handle. This is the axis theory, and it explains more about human history than almost any other single factor. Europe runs east to west for about 4,000 miles, all within a relatively narrow band of latitudes. This meant innovations could spread like wildfire. A new plough design invented in France could be adopted in Poland within a generation. A crop domesticated in Greece could reach Britain in a few centuries. Knowledge, technology, genes, they all flowed horizontally across the continent with relatively little adaptation required. Asia, by contrast, is massive and vertical. From Siberia to Indonesia spans nearly 8,000 miles of latitude, crossing every climate zone imaginable. Arctic tundra, temperate forests, scorching deserts, tropical jungles. An innovation that worked in Mongolia was useless in Vietnam. Crops that thrived in northern China died in Thailand. Each region had to reinvent survival strategies from scratch because knowledge transfer was so difficult across such extreme environmental variation. But the axis orientation was just the beginning. The real story is in the barriers, the geological features that turned Eurasia into a continent of isolated pockets rather than a unified whole. Start with the Himalayas. Not just the highest mountain range on Earth, but the most effective barrier to human migration ever created by geology. For millions of years, the Indian subcontinent has been slowly colliding with Asia, pushing up these impossible peaks that separate South Asia from East Asia like a wall built by gods. There are passes, sure, narrow corridors like the Silk Road routes through the Karakoram, but they're brutal, death traps at high altitudes where weather can turn lethal in minutes. For most of human history, moving large populations or armies across the Himalayas was simply impossible. This meant India and China developed in almost complete isolation from each other, despite being neighbours. Two of the world's great civilizations, separated by rock and ice. Then there's the Gobi Desert, a vast ocean of sand and stone stretching across northern China and Mongolia. Another barrier, this one horizontal, separating the steppe peoples of Central Asia from the agricultural civilizations of China proper. The Gobi wasn't completely impassable. Nomadic herders figured out how to survive there, but it was brutal enough that it created a permanent cultural divide. On one side, settled farmers building elaborate civilizations. On the other, mobile pastoralists living in felt tents and following their herds. They traded sometimes, they fought, often, but they remained fundamentally different peoples shaped by the geography that separated them. Central Asia itself was another kind of barrier. The vast steppes stretching from Hungary to Mongolia, flat grasslands that seemed like they should have facilitated movement. And they did, but only for certain kinds of societies. Nomadic horse peoples thrived there. They could cover huge distances, maintaining trade networks and occasionally erupting westward or southward to terrorize settled civilizations. But for agricultural societies, the steppes were a desert. Not enough rainfall for farming, too exposed for permanent settlements. This created a permanent buffer zone between Europe and East Asia, a region where empires rose and fell but never quite stabilized into lasting civilizations. Now contrast this with Europe. Europe is small, compact, and absolutely riddled with natural highways. The Mediterranean Sea, which might seem like a barrier, actually became the greatest facilitator of cultural exchange in human history. Ancient sailors could island hop from Greece to Italy to Spain, spreading ideas, genes, and technologies throughout the southern rim of Europe with relative ease. The Mediterranean wasn't a wall, it was a highway. And the rivers. God, the rivers. Europe has navigable rivers running everywhere. The Rhine, the Danube, the Seine, the Thames, the Volga. Each one a natural trade route penetrating deep into the continent. You could load goods onto a boat in the North Sea and travel hundreds of miles inland without ever touching a road. This meant even landlocked regions weren't really isolated. They were connected to coastal trade networks through these watery arteries. Asia had rivers too, massive ones. The Yangtze, the Yellow River, the Ganges, the Mekong. But they mostly ran north-south, parallel to each other rather than connecting different regions. They facilitated unity within regions. China used its rivers to bind the country together, but they didn't create the kind of continent-wide trade networks that European rivers enabled. Each river system created its own civilization sphere, largely isolated from the others. The coastlines tell their own story. Europe has an incredibly convoluted coastline relative to its size. Peninsulas jutting out everywhere, islands scattered offshore, deep bays and natural harbours. This geographical reality practically forced Europeans to become seafarers. If you lived in Greece or Scandinavia or Portugal, you were never more than a short distance from the ocean. Fishing, trading, exploring by sea, these weren't luxuries, they were necessities. European culture became fundamentally maritime, oriented toward the sea as both a resource and a highway. Mainland Asia, except for the southern and eastern coasts, is different. Vast landlocked regions where the ocean is a distant concept. Central Asia, the Tibetan Plateau, Western China. These are places where people could live entire lives without ever seeing salt water. The cultures that developed there were land-based, oriented around rivers, oases, and overland trade routes. Even in coastal regions like India and China, the sheer size of the landmass meant that maritime culture was just one option among many, not the defining feature of civilization. This created fundamentally different approaches to expansion and trade. Europeans, confined to a relatively small continent with easy water access, looked outward. The age of exploration wasn't an accident. It was geography manifesting as history. When European powers wanted to expand, the obvious route was across the oceans. They had the shipbuilding traditions, the navigational skills, and the cultural momentum to make it happen. Asian empires, by contrast, generally expanded overland when they expanded at all. The Mongol Empire, the largest contiguous land empire in history, spread across the steppes using horses and traditional nomadic military tactics. The Chinese empires expanded by pushing into neighbouring regions and slowly assimilating them. There were exceptions, the Ming Dynasty treasure fleet being the most famous, but they were exceptions. The geographical default was continental, not maritime. And then there are the subcontinental barriers that created pockets of isolation within Asia itself. The jungles of Southeast Asia, dense tropical forests that made communication between regions incredibly difficult. The Indonesian archipelago, thousands of islands creating thousands of micro-environments, each developing its own languages and cultures. Japan, isolated enough by water that it could spend centuries in deliberate seclusion, developing a unique civilization that borrowed from China and Korea but remained distinctly Japanese. Europe had its barriers too, the Alps, the Pyrenees, the English Channel, but they were smaller, more permeable. The Alps divided Italy from northern Europe, but passes like the Brenner made regular traffic possible. The English Channel isolated Britain, but it was narrow enough that invasions happened regularly enough to keep the island connected to continental developments. The Pyrenees isolated Iberia, but not completely. Ideas and armies crossed regularly. The net effect of all this geography was profound. Europe developed as a collection of competing but constantly interacting cultures, states that fought constantly but also traded, intermarried, and stole each other's innovations. Competition drove innovation because no single power could dominate permanently. The barriers were high enough to allow distinct cultures to form, but low enough that those cultures were in constant contact. Asia developed as a collection of civilizational spheres, each massive and largely self-contained. China, India, the Islamic world, Southeast Asia, each developed sophisticated civilizations that could last for millennia without fundamental outside influence. When these spheres did interact, usually through trade along routes like the Silk Road, the exchange was profound but intermittent. Long periods of isolation punctuated by bursts of contact. This geographical reality shaped everything that came after. It determined which crops spread where, which technologies got adopted by whom, which ideas circulated and which remained local. It even shaped military history. European armies were constantly fighting each other, driving rapid innovation in weapons and tactics. Asian powers often faced different challenges, managing vast territories, defending against nomadic raiders, maintaining control over diverse populations. None of this was destiny. Geography didn't determine outcomes, it shaped probabilities. It made certain developments more likely and others less so. A civilization could work against its geographical constraints, Japan becoming a maritime power despite its isolation, China building the Grand Canal to connect north and south. But these achievements required enormous effort precisely because they were working against the grain of the land. And here's what makes all this so fascinating. The people living through this didn't know they were being shaped by geography. They just knew that the neighbours over the mountains spoke a different language, that the people across the sea had strange customs, that moving goods from here to there was easy or hard depending on the route. They experienced the effects without understanding the cause. But we can see it now. The invisible hand of geography pushing populations this way and that, channeling human creativity and ambition along paths determined by ancient tectonic forces. The land shaped the people, and the people shaped their civilizations according to the possibilities the land presented. And this was just the physical geography. Wait until you see what climate did to human development. Because temperature, rainfall, and seasons were about to create even deeper divisions between populations that had started out identical. Now imagine this. Two groups of humans, same species, same ancestors, same genetic bottleneck survival story. They split apart maybe 50,000 years ago, practically yesterday in evolutionary terms. One group heads north and west into Europe. The other pushes east across Asia. And the world they encountered, it wasn't the same world at all. Europe was in the grip of the Ice Age. Not constantly, not everywhere, but the glaciers were real. Massive sheets of ice covering Scandinavia, pushing down into what's now Germany and Poland. Winters that lasted 8-9 months. Summers so brief you could barely call them summers at all. The people who moved into this landscape weren't just visiting, they were staying. And staying meant adapting or dying. Asia was cold too, but differently cold. The eastern regions faced brutal winters, yes, but they also had monsoons, dramatic seasonal swings that could turn a landscape from frozen wasteland to humid growing season in a matter of weeks. The Himalayas created their own weather patterns, rain shadows that left some areas perpetually dry while others flooded annually. Central Asia became vast grasslands, steppes that stretched forever, with temperature extremes that would kill you if you weren't prepared. These weren't just different climates, they were different evolutionary pressures, and over thousands of years, tens of thousands of years, they sculpted human bodies in ways that are still visible today. Let's start with the most obvious one. Skin colour. This isn't about race or superiority or any of that modern nonsense. This is about survival. Pure and simple. Your skin colour is essentially a climate adaptation device, a biological response to one of the most critical challenges humans faced as they spread across the planet. How do you get enough vitamin D without getting killed by UV radiation? In Africa, where humans evolved, the sun is intense. UV radiation streams down relentlessly, year-round. Too much UV radiation damages your DNA, destroys folate in your bloodstream, causes skin cancer, reduces fertility. Dark skin is nature's sunscreen. The melanin pigment absorbs UV radiation before it can penetrate deeper tissues. If you're living near the equator, dark skin isn't just advantageous, it's essential for survival. But when those African populations moved north into Europe, everything changed. Suddenly, UV radiation wasn't the enemy, it was scarce. At northern latitudes, especially during those long Ice Age winters, sunlight strikes the Earth at such an oblique angle that UV intensity drops dramatically. You might get a few hours of weak sunlight during the day and that's it. Here's the problem. Humans need UV radiation. Not a lot, but enough to trigger vitamin D synthesis in the skin. Vitamin D is absolutely critical. Without it, your bones don't develop properly. Children get rickets, a devastating condition that deforms the skeleton and can kill. Adults get osteomalacia, bone softening that leads to fractures and disability. Women with severe vitamin D deficiency can't give birth successfully because their pelvises deform. So, natural selection went to work. Over thousands of generations, European populations became lighter skinned. Not all at once, not uniformly, but steadily. Lighter skin allows more UV radiation to penetrate, enabling vitamin D synthesis even under the weak northern sun. It's a perfect adaptation to high-latitude environments. The people who happened to be born with slightly lighter skin had healthier children who survived to reproduce. Generation after generation, the trait became more common. But look at Asian populations and something interesting happens. They're not as light-skinned as Europeans, even though many Asian regions are at similar latitudes. Why? Because the evolutionary pressures were different. East Asian populations had to balance multiple factors, not just UV radiation and vitamin D. They developed something else entirely. Look at East Asian faces and you'll notice the epicanthic fold, that distinctive crease of skin that covers the inner corner of the eye and often makes the eyelid appear smaller. This isn't random. This isn't aesthetic preference encoded in genes. This is climate adaptation as sophisticated as anything evolution has ever produced. The epicanthic fold protects the eye in extreme cold and wind. It reduces the exposed surface area of the eyeball, minimizes moisture loss in dry winter air, and helps protect against snow blindness from intense reflected light. Some researchers think it might also help retain heat around the eye socket, preventing tissue damage in sub-zero temperatures. Populations that developed in Siberia, Mongolia, northern China, the brutal continental climate zones of Asia, they needed this adaptation. But there's more. Body proportions change too, following patterns that make perfect biological sense. In cold climates, you want to conserve heat. the human body loses heat primarily through exposed surface area. So, natural selection favoured shorter limbs and more compact torsos in cold, adapted populations. Less surface area relative to body volume means better heat retention. Look at traditional Northern European and Northern Asian populations. Stockier builds, relatively shorter arms and legs compared to torso length. Now compare that to populations from tropical Africa. Longer limbs, leaner builds, more surface area relative to body mass, which helps dissipate heat in hot climates. This follows a biological principle called Bergmann's rule. Within a species, populations in colder climates tend to have larger, more compact bodies than those in warmer climates. It's all about thermal efficiency. Your body is constantly fighting to maintain a stable internal temperature. In the Ice Age conditions of Europe and Northern Asia, that fight was desperate. People who were slightly better at retaining heat had slightly higher survival rates. Over thousands of generations, those small advantages accumulated into visible physical differences. But climate didn't just shape bodies, it shaped cultures, technologies, entire ways of life. Because the seasonal variations across Europe and Asia weren't just weather. They were survival challenges that required different solutions. Europe's Ice Age climate was seasonal but somewhat predictable. You had summers when plants grew and animals were active. You had winters when everything shut down, and you survived on stored food or starved. This created intense selection pressure for planning, storage technology, and seasonal coordination. Archaeological evidence shows European populations developing increasingly sophisticated food preservation methods, smoking meat to preserve it through winter, storing grains in underground pits, learning which plants could be dried and stored, which would spoil. This wasn't just practical knowledge. This was survival technology that took generations to refine, and it shaped the agricultural calendar when farming finally arrived. European agriculture became organized around dramatic seasonal shifts. Plant in spring, grow through summer, harvest in fall, survive winter on stored food. The entire social calendar, the festivals, the religious observations, even the concept of the year itself, all structured around this seasonal rhythm. Asia developed differently. The monsoon patterns created different pressures. In much of East and South Asia, you didn't have a simple warm season, cold season pattern. You had wet seasons and dry seasons, sometimes multiple cycles per year. The arrival of the monsoon could transform a parched landscape into a flooded one in days. This created different agricultural strategies. Rice cultivation, which became central to Asian civilizations, requires managing water with incredible precision. Too little and crops fail. Too much and they flood. Asian farmers became masters of water management, irrigation, and drainage systems thousands of years before European agriculture achieved similar sophistication. The climate also shaped dietary evolution in fascinating ways. European populations facing long winters with limited fresh food developed higher tolerances for preserved foods high in salt and fat. Many Northern European populations evolved the ability to continue digesting lactose into adulthood, a trait called lactase persistence. This allowed them to consume milk and dairy products year-round, providing critical protein and fat during winter scarcity. Asian populations developed different dietary adaptations. Many East Asian populations maintained the ancestral human pattern of lactose intolerance after childhood, but developed enhanced ability to digest complex carbohydrates, particularly the starches in rice and millet. Some populations developed genetic variants that help process plant-based diets more efficiently, allowing them to thrive on grain-heavy cuisines. These weren't conscious choices. Nobody sat down and decided to evolve lactase persistence or enhanced starch digestion. These were natural selection responses to available food sources. People who could effectively digest the foods available in their environment had more children who survived to adulthood. Over hundreds of generations, these traits became population characteristics, and the climate pressures drove technological innovation in ways that are still visible today. European populations, facing the need to heat dwellings through brutal winters, became experts at chimney construction, insulation, and efficient heating systems. Asian populations dealing with monsoons and seasonal flooding developed sophisticated raised floor architecture, water-resistant building materials, and drainage systems. Cold weather drove clothing innovations. European populations developed fitted garments, layered clothing systems, sophisticated use of animal furs and woven textiles to trap body heat. Asian populations in extreme climates developed their own solutions: quilted garments filled with insulating materials, felt-making techniques for nomadic peoples on the steppes. Even hunting and gathering strategies diverged based on climate. European Ice Age hunters developed technologies for taking down massive cold-adapted mammals, mammoths, woolly rhinoceros, giant deer. This required coordinated group hunting, sophisticated weapons, and the ability to process enormous quantities of meat and materials from a single kill. Asian populations adapted to different prey. In some regions, smaller game and intensive plant gathering. In others, fishing technologies that could exploit seasonal fish runs. On the steppes, horse domestication eventually emerged, creating an entirely different relationship between humans and their environment. Here's what's really remarkable. All of this happened in what is, evolutionarily speaking, the blink of an eye. 50,000 years, maybe 60,000 for the earliest migrations. That's roughly 2,000 to 3,000 generations. In that time, populations went from being physically indistinguishable to displaying obvious, visible differences. But they remained the same species, could still interbreed, still shared the vast majority of their DNA. The differences, while real and visible, were surface-level adaptations to local conditions. Underneath, the same basic human blueprint, the same brain architecture, the same capacity for language, culture, and innovation. The climate had sculpted different solutions to survival, but it hadn't created different kinds of humans. It had created adapted humans, populations fine-tuned to their environments through the relentless logic of natural selection. Each group carrying the genetic heritage of the bottleneck survivors, each bearing the mark of climate pressures that shaped their bodies and their cultures, but all still fundamentally, undeniably human. And those climate-driven adaptations were about to shape something even more profound. Because the next revolution wasn't going to be about surviving the environment, it was going to be about controlling it. But here's where the story gets really interesting. Around 12,000 years ago, something extraordinary happened. Not a disaster this time, but an innovation so profound it would reshape human societies forever. People in two different parts of the world, completely independently, figured out how to do something that would change everything. They learned to farm. Now, this might not sound revolutionary. Plant seeds, harvest crops, repeat. Simple, right? But agriculture wasn't just about food production. It was about fundamentally reorganizing human existence, about transforming mobile hunter-gatherers into settled communities. And here's the crucial part. The exact way this transformation unfolded depended entirely on where you were standing on the planet. Two regions led this revolution. In the west, the fertile Crescent, that arc of land stretching from the Persian Gulf through modern Iraq, Syria, Lebanon, and down into Egypt. In the east, the Yellow River Valley in northern China. Both areas had the right combination of climate, wild plants, and animal species to make agriculture possible. But they had very different wild species available, This single fact created divergent paths that would shape human civilization for the next 10,000 years. Let's start in the Fertile Crescent, because this is where the ancestors of modern Europeans got their agricultural toolkit. Around 10,000 BCE, people living in this region started noticing something interesting about certain wild grasses. Emmer wheat and barley grew naturally in the hills. They produced seeds you could harvest, store, and most importantly replant. The plants were self-pollinating, which made them genetically stable. You could collect seeds from the best plants, save them, plant them the next season, and gradually, generation by generation, those plants would become more productive, easier to harvest, better suited to cultivation. Within just a few thousand years, these wild grasses had been transformed into domesticated crops. The seeds became larger, the stalks stronger, the harvest more reliable. And here's what's crucial about wheat and barley. They're what scientists call low-labour crops. You plant them in the fall, basically ignore them all winter, and harvest them in late spring. Sure, there's work involved, ploughing, weeding, harvesting, but it's seasonal work. You have intense periods of labour punctuated by long stretches where the crops basically take care of themselves. This created a specific kind of social structure. Farmers could accumulate surplus, store grain through the winter, support people who weren't producing food, specialists like toolmakers, priests, administrators. But because the work was seasonal and individual families could manage their own fields, there was room for independent landholders, small farmers who controlled their own production. Now travel east to the Yellow River Valley. Different geography, different climate, completely different wild plants available. The people here figured out how to cultivate two main crops, foxtail millet and rice. Rice especially would become the foundation of East Asian civilization. But rice farming is nothing like wheat farming, nothing at all. Rice requires constant attention. First, you need to create paddies, flooded fields with carefully maintained water levels. This means building and maintaining complex irrigation systems, dikes, canals, drainage channels. Then there's the planting. Rice seedlings need to be transplanted by hand into the flooded paddies, bent over in knee-deep water for hours at a time. As the rice grows, water levels must be constantly monitored and adjusted. Too much water, the plants rot. Too little, they dry out. The harvest is equally labour-intensive. Unlike wheat that can be cut with a sickle and threshed mechanically, rice requires careful hand harvesting of individual plants. Every grain matters because the yields are precious. This isn't seasonal work. This is year-round intensive labour. But here's the thing. Rice farming produces massive yields. A rice paddy, properly maintained, can feed far more people per acre than wheat fields. The caloric output is extraordinary, but you can't do it alone. One family cannot build and maintain the irrigation systems needed for rice cultivation. You need coordinated group effort, dozens of families working together, sharing labour, sharing water resources. This created entirely different social structures. Rice farming villages had to cooperate or fail. Nobody could be independent. You needed your neighbours to help maintain the communal irrigation systems. You needed to show up for collective planting and harvesting. Individual autonomy had to be subordinated to group success. Over thousands of years, this created what anthropologists call collectivist social patterns. The group's needs taking precedence over individual desires. Harmony and cooperation valued above independence and innovation. Compare this to wheat farming societies where individual families could succeed or fail on their own merits, where surplus could be accumulated privately, where independence was not just possible but often advantageous. These societies developed what we now call individualist patterns. Personal achievement valued, competition encouraged, individual rights emphasized over communal obligations. Neither system was better or worse. They were adaptations to different agricultural realities, but they created profound cultural differences that persist today. Differences in how people think about themselves, their relationships, their obligations to others. Then there were the animals. The Fertile Crescent had an incredible advantage here. Within a few thousand miles you had aurochs, wild cattle that could be domesticated, wild sheep and goats in the hills, wild horses on the steppes, wild pigs in the forests. All of these animals had the right characteristics for domestication. They were herd animals with established dominance hierarchies, meaning they would accept humans as their leaders. They reproduced relatively quickly. They could survive on vegetation humans couldn't digest, effectively turning grass into meat, milk, leather, and labour. By 8000 BCE, farmers in the Fertile Crescent had domesticated all of these species. This gave them massive advantages. Cattle could pull ploughs, multiplying agricultural productivity. Horses could transport goods and people. Sheep provided wool for clothing and textiles. Animals produced manure, enriching soil that would otherwise be depleted by constant cropping. Most importantly, domesticated animals provided concentrated protein, allowing larger populations to survive on smaller territories. These advantages spread. As farming expanded from the Fertile Crescent into Europe, North Africa, and Western Asia, it carried this complete agricultural package: wheat and barley, cattle and sheep, ploughs and carts, the whole system together, creating societies that could support dense populations, accumulate surplus wealth, and develop increasingly complex social hierarchies. China had animals too, but different ones. Pigs and chickens, both domesticated early. These were important sources of protein, but they couldn't pull ploughs. They couldn't transport heavy loads. Water buffalo would eventually be domesticated for rice paddy work, but much later than cattle domestication in the West. Horses existed in China, but they were always relatively scarce, more valuable as military assets than agricultural tools. This meant Chinese agriculture remained more labour-intensive, human and animal power rather than human and cattle power. More people needed per acre of farmland. This wasn't a disadvantage necessarily. Remember, rice produces enormous yields. Chinese agriculture could support massive populations. But it required different social organisation, more coordination, more collective effort. The population density differences were staggering. By 2000 BCE, the Yellow River Valley was supporting populations that would have been unimaginable in equivalent territories in Europe. Hundreds of people per square mile, all fed by intensive rice cultivation. This required unprecedented levels of social organisation. Someone needed to coordinate all those farmers, allocate water resources, resolve disputes, organise collective projects. This is where early states emerged, not from conquest necessarily, but from agricultural necessity. You needed administrators to manage irrigation systems, record keepers to track which families had contributed what labour, enforcers to ensure everyone did their part. Gradually, these administrative functions became institutionalised, formalised, transformed into what we recognise as government. In the Fertile Crescent and Europe, the path was different. Lower population density meant less immediate need for intensive coordination. States emerged more from military competition than agricultural management. Warrior chiefs who could protect farmers from raiders. Strongmen who could accumulate enough surplus to support armies. Conquest and expansion rather than internal administration driving political development. The irrigation systems themselves tell the story. In China, water management required massive collective effort. The Yellow River is unpredictable, flooding catastrophically one season, running dry the next. Controlling it required dikes, canals, reservoirs, engineering projects involving thousands of workers coordinated over decades. Succeeding at this created the institutional capacity for large-scale organization, the administrative apparatus that would eventually become imperial bureaucracy. Compare this to Europe, where rivers were smaller, rainfall more, reliable, irrigation less critical. Farmers could succeed with local water sources, wells, small streams, minimal coordination required. Political authority emerged more from military strength and hydraulic management. Kings were warriors first, administrators second. These different agricultural foundations created different philosophical traditions. In societies where cooperation was essential for survival, philosophies emerged that emphasized harmony, collective responsibility, fitting into the natural and social order. Confucianism in China with its focus on proper relationships and social hierarchy. Taoism emphasizing flow and adaptation. Buddhism spreading easily through cultures already comfortable with subordinating individual desires to larger purposes. In societies where individual families could succeed independently, philosophies emerged that emphasized personal autonomy, individual rights, the dignity and freedom of the individual human being. Greek philosophy with its focus on rational individuals debating truth. Later, Christianity's emphasis on personal salvation and individual conscience. Enlightenment philosophy celebrating individual liberty and human rights. None of this was predetermined. The people in China weren't inherently more collectivist. Europeans weren't naturally more individualistic. But 10,000 years of living in societies organized around different agricultural systems that shapes how people think. Rice paddies require cooperation, so cooperation becomes a virtue. Wheat fields allow independence, so independence becomes valued. Generation after generation, these patterns reinforce themselves, becoming not just practical necessities but cultural values, moral principles, self-evident truths. And here's what's really remarkable. These agricultural choices made 10,000 years ago are still shaping human societies today. The regions that developed rice cultivation still show measurably more collectivist social patterns. The wheat-growing regions still emphasize individualism. It's not absolute. It's not deterministic. Culture changes, societies evolve. But the deep patterns persist, written into the landscape itself, coded into the very crops that feed us. Because agriculture wasn't just about food. It was about organizing human cooperation at unprecedented scales, and the specific ways that cooperation was organized, determined by what crops grew where, created the foundations for everything that came after. The empires and philosophies, the religions and technologies, all of it built on the simple fact that wheat and rice required different kinds of work, creating different kinds of societies. The seeds planted 10,000 years ago are still bearing fruit today, still shaping how people live, think, organize themselves, still creating the differences that make human civilization so endlessly diverse and endlessly fascinating. But the story doesn't end with agriculture. These different social foundations would support radically different approaches to language, thought, and meaning itself. Now here's something that'll keep you wondering. We've talked about how geography shaped bodies, how climate influenced civilizations, how farming transformed societies. But there's another force that may have shaped European and Asian minds even more profoundly. Language itself. Not just what people said, but how they said it. The very structure of the words they spoke, the writing systems they developed, the ways they organized thought on the page and in their minds. This wasn't just about communication. This was about cognition, about the fundamental architecture of human thinking. And between Europe and Asia, that architecture evolved in radically different directions. Let's start with the obvious question. Why do Europeans mostly speak related languages while Asian languages seem so wildly different from each other and from European tongues? The answer takes us back about 6,000 years. Around 4000 BCE, somewhere in the grasslands north of the Black Sea, a group of people we now call the Proto-Indo-Europeans began a migration that would reshape the linguistic map of the world. These weren't empire builders, not yet. They were pastoralists, people who had mastered horse domestication and wagon technology. And those two innovations gave them something unprecedented: mobility. Within about 2,000 years, their descendants had spread from Ireland to India. Everywhere they went, their language went with them. It evolved, changed, adapted to local conditions, but it remained fundamentally connected. The result? Modern English, German, French, Spanish, Russian, Hindi, Persian, they're all cousins, all descendants of that original Proto-Indo-European tongue. You can see the family resemblance in the most basic words. Mother is mater in Latin, meter in Greek, matar in Hindi. Father is pater, Peter. 3 is tres, trays, teen. The connections run deep, embedded in the very fabric of how hundreds of millions of people speak today. But here's what's fascinating: this massive linguistic expansion didn't happen in Asia the same way. China had its own linguistic revolution, but it went in a completely different direction. The Sino-Tibetan language family, which includes Chinese and hundreds of related languages, stayed more geographically contained. It spread, yes, but it also fragmented in different ways. Chinese itself split into dozens of mutually unintelligible dialects, spoken languages so different that a person from Beijing and a person from Guangzhou couldn't understand each other's speech at all. Yet they could read the same texts. Because Chinese developed something unique, a writing system that transcended pronunciation. This is where things get really interesting. Europe and the Middle East developed alphabetic writing systems, letters that represent sounds. You learn 20-some symbols, you can write any word in your language. Simple, efficient, relatively easy to learn. China developed logographic writing, characters that represent meaning, not sound. Thousands of symbols, each one requiring memorization, each one carrying layers of semantic information that go far beyond simple pronunciation. Think about what this means cognitively. When a European child learns to read, they're learning a code. Sound to symbol, symbol to sound. It's abstract, but it's systematic. You can sound out words you've never seen before. When a Chinese child learns to read, they're learning a visual language. Each character is a unique image that must be memorized, connected to meaning and pronunciation separately. The character for good combines the characters for woman and child. The character for peace shows a woman under a roof. Meaning is built into the structure of the writing itself. This isn't better or worse. It's different. And that difference shaped cognition in ways we're only beginning to understand. Studies show that Chinese readers process text differently than alphabetic readers. Their brains activate different neural pathways. Chinese readers engage more visual processing areas, treat characters more like pictures than abstract symbols. Western readers engage more phonological processing, converting symbols to sounds even when reading silently. But the implications go deeper than just reading. Language structure itself may shape how we think about the world. This is the controversial Sapir-Whorf hypothesis, the idea that the language you speak influences the thoughts you can think. The strong version of this hypothesis, that language completely determines thought, has been largely debunked. But the weak version, that language influences thought, patterns of attention, and habitual ways of categorizing experience, that's looking increasingly solid. Consider verb tenses. European languages are obsessed with time. English has 12 major tenses, ways to precisely specify when something happened, is happening, or will happen. Past, present, future, perfect, progressive. Every sentence requires you to commit to a temporal framework. Mandarin Chinese doesn't require marking tenses at all. You can specify time if you want to, but the language doesn't force you to think about temporal relationships in every single sentence. Instead, it emphasizes aspect, whether an action is completed or ongoing, and context to determine when things happened. Does this make Chinese speakers think about time differently than English speakers? Some researchers think yes. Studies suggest Chinese speakers find it easier to think about time in vertical terms, earlier events as up and later events as down, matching how time is written in traditional Chinese texts. English speakers tend to think of time horizontally, moving from left to right, matching how we write and read, or consider how languages handle responsibility and agency. English requires specifying who did what in almost every sentence. I broke the vase, the agent, the action, the object. Clear, explicit, impossible to avoid assigning responsibility. Many Asian languages allow and even prefer more indirect constructions. In Japanese, you might say something closer to the vase broke, without specifying who broke it. In Korean, the passive voice is used much more commonly than in English, sometimes making it deliberately unclear who performed an action. This isn't evasion. It's a different way of constructing social reality. In cultures that emphasize collective harmony over individual assertion, language structures that soften agency and avoid direct confrontation make perfect sense. The language doesn't just reflect the culture, it reinforces it, makes certain ways of thinking feel natural and others feel awkward. Grammar structures encode cultural values in surprisingly deep ways. European languages typically put the subject first. I do this, you do that. The individual agent is the starting point of almost every sentence. This mirrors and reinforces cultural emphasis on individual action, personal responsibility, the autonomous self. Many Asian languages, particularly Japanese and Korean, put the verb at the end of the sentence. The action, the conclusion, the outcome comes last. You have to listen to the entire sentence before you know what's being said. This encourages patience, attention to context, consideration of all factors before jumping to conclusions. Chinese puts descriptive information before the thing being described. Big red old book, not old big red book. The modifiers come in a specific order, from general to specific, from outside to inside. This reflects a cognitive pattern that moves from context to detail, from the general framework to the specific instance. None of this is deterministic. Chinese speakers can think individualistically. English speakers can think holistically. But the language you speak creates grooves in your thinking, pathways of least resistance, default patterns that shape how you habitually process information. And then there's writing itself, the technology of preserving thought across time. The differences between alphabetic and logographic systems created divergent intellectual traditions that persisted for millennia. Alphabetic writing was democratic in a way logographic writing never could be. Once you learned your letters, you could write anything. Literacy was achievable for ordinary people. This is partly why Greece developed philosophy that emphasized rational argument, why Christianity spread through written texts that anyone could theoretically read, why the European Enlightenment emphasized universal education and literacy. Chinese writing was inherently elite. Learning thousands of characters took years of study, usually requiring formal education unavailable to peasants. This created a scholar official class whose authority was partly based on their monopoly of literacy. The Chinese civil service examination system, which lasted for over 1,000 years, was built on this foundation. Masters of written Chinese became the administrators of empire. But logographic writing also preserved meaning across vast dialectical differences. A text written in classical Chinese could be read and understood by an educated person anywhere in the Chinese cultural sphere, regardless of what language they actually spoke. This created cultural unity across geographical diversity in a way alphabetic writing never could. Japanese speakers, Korean speakers, Vietnamese speakers, even though their spoken languages were completely unrelated to Chinese, could all access the same classical texts because they had adopted Chinese characters. This created an East Asian intellectual commonwealth, a shared library of knowledge that transcended linguistic boundaries. Meanwhile, the alphabetic systems of Europe were fracturing. Latin gave way to Romance languages, Germanic languages, Slavic languages, all written in similar scripts but increasingly mutually unintelligible. The classical learning of Greece and Rome had to be translated, reinterpreted, sometimes lost entirely when languages and empires fell. This had unexpected consequences for knowledge preservation. Chinese philosophy, science, and history maintained remarkable continuity across thousands of years. A Chinese scholar in 1800 CE could read texts written in 500 BCE, not easily, but far more readily than a European scholar of the same era could read ancient Greek or Latin without years of specialized study. But European linguistic fragmentation created something else: intellectual competition. Different linguistic communities developed different philosophical traditions, different scientific approaches, different ways of organizing knowledge. When they encountered each other, through trade, war, or cultural exchange, they had to argue, translate, synthesize. This friction generated innovation. The divergence extended even to how knowledge was organized conceptually. Chinese classification systems tended to be relational and contextual. Things were categorized by how they related to human concerns, by their role in the cosmic order, by their practical applications. European classification systems, influenced by Greek philosophy, emphasized abstract categories and binary distinctions: animal, vegetable, mineral, genus and species. Clear hierarchies and taxonomies that assumed nature could be carved at its joints, divided into discrete non-overlapping categories. Neither system was objectively superior. Each captured certain patterns while obscuring others, but they led to different styles of scientific inquiry. European science became reductionist, focused on breaking things down into components, finding universal laws that applied everywhere. Asian science remained more holistic, more interested in relationships and contexts, in how things functioned within larger systems. And all of this, every bit of it, traces back to those early linguistic divergences, to the Indo-European expansion that created related languages across Europe and the Middle East, to the Chinese development of logographic writing that unified vast populations around shared texts, to the grammatical structures that made certain thoughts easy and others awkward. Language didn't determine destiny, but it shaped the tools with which different cultures thought about destiny, debated it, passed their conclusions to future generations. It created mental habits that persisted for millennia, influencing everything from philosophy to governance to scientific method. We're all still thinking, at least partly, in patterns laid down thousands of years ago by the languages our ancestors spoke and the writing systems they invented. Different words really did create different worlds, different ways of being human. And those differences would become even more pronounced when people began asking the biggest questions of all. Questions about meaning, purpose, the nature of existence itself. Questions that would give birth to the world's great religious and philosophical traditions. But humans weren't just competing for food and territory. They were beginning to ask bigger questions, questions that had no obvious answers. Why are we here? What happens when we die? How should we live? These questions emerged wherever humans settled, but the answers would diverge in ways that would shape civilizations for millennia. Around 2,500 years ago, something extraordinary happened. Almost simultaneously, across thousands of miles of separation, multiple civilizations experienced philosophical revolutions. In Greece, thinkers like Socrates were challenging people to question everything. In China, Confucius was establishing principles of social harmony. In India, Buddha was teaching the path to enlightenment. In Persia, Zoroaster was preaching about cosmic battles between good and evil. This wasn't coincidence. These were agricultural societies that had accumulated enough surplus wealth that some people could spend their time thinking instead of just surviving. But the questions they asked and the answers they found, those were shaped by thousands of years of separate development. Let's start with Greece. Picture Athens in the 5th century BCE, a city-state small enough that citizens could gather in one place to debate the issues of the day. The Greeks developed something radical, the idea that truth could be discovered through individual reasoning and debate. Socrates wandering the marketplace, challenging people's assumptions. Plato imagining ideal forms beyond physical reality. Aristotle systematically categorizing everything from politics to physics. Greek philosophy was intensely individualistic. The goal was personal enlightenment, individual understanding of truth. They celebrated the lone thinker who could see what others missed. They built statues to honor individual philosophers, wrote down the names of individual students, traced intellectual lineages from teacher to student. This makes perfect sense when you understand Greek geography and history. Remember those isolated valleys and scattered islands. Greek city-states were independent, often competing, each with its own identity. Citizens of Athens saw themselves as individuals first, with rights and responsibilities separate from the collective. Their democracy, imperfect as it was, reflected this belief in individual voice and individual reason. The Greeks also developed a particular relationship with their gods. Greek deities were powerful but flawed, basically immortal humans with supernatural abilities. You could argue with them, trick them, even occasionally defy them. Greek religion didn't demand absolute submission. It demanded proper ritual, sure, but it left room for human agency and choice. Now shift your perspective east, way east, to the Yellow River Valley where Confucius lived around the same time as Socrates. But Confucius asked completely different questions. He wasn't interested in abstract truth or ideal forms. He wanted to know, how do we create harmony? How do we maintain social order? How do we ensure that children respect parents, that subjects serve rulers, that everyone knows their place? Confucianism wasn't about individual enlightenment. It was about collective harmony. The fundamental unit wasn't the individual, it was the relationship, father and son, husband and wife, ruler and subject, elder and younger, friend and friend. You couldn't understand yourself outside these relationships. Your identity was defined by your position in the social web. This philosophy emerged from a very different environment than Greek individualism. China's vast river valleys required massive coordination to manage irrigation, prevent floods, and defend against invasions. You couldn't have thousands of independent city-states arguing about philosophy. You needed unified hierarchies, clear chains of command, everyone working together toward collective goals. Confucian teaching emphasized filial piety, respect for ancestors, and social roles over individual desires. The good person wasn't someone who questioned everything like Socrates. The good person was someone who fulfilled their duties, who maintained harmony, who put family and society above personal ambition. But China also produced something completely different: Taoism. If Confucianism was about order and structure, Taoism was about flow and naturalness. Laozi, possibly a contemporary of Confucius, taught that the best way to live was to align yourself with the Tao, the natural way of things. Don't force, don't struggle. Be like water, flowing around obstacles rather than confronting them directly. Taoism emerged from the same landscape as Confucianism, but represented a different response to it, where Confucius saw the chaos of the warring states period and prescribed order. Taoist thinkers saw the futility of forcing human will onto nature and society. They advocated withdrawal, simplicity, harmony with natural rhythms rather than attempts to control them. These weren't contradictory in Chinese thought. They were complementary. You could be Confucian in your public life, maintaining proper relationships and social harmony, while being Taoist in your private life, cultivating inner peace and naturalness. The Chinese mind could hold both, switching between them as situations required. Meanwhile, in India, another revolution was happening. Buddhism emerged as a response to the rigid caste system of Hinduism, but it took ideas in directions nobody had anticipated. Buddha's central insight was that suffering comes from attachment, from desire, from the illusion that we are permanent separate selves. Enlightenment meant seeing through this illusion, achieving a state beyond suffering. But watch what happens when Buddhism travels. This is where things get really interesting. Buddhism spread from India across Asia, but it transformed in every place it landed, adapting to local conditions like a biological organism evolving in new environments. In Tibet, Buddhism merged with the indigenous Bon religion, creating Tibetan Buddhism with its elaborate rituals, colourful iconography, and complex monastery systems. The harsh Himalayan environment, the isolation of mountain communities, these shaped a form of Buddhism focused on intensive meditation practices and elaborate visualization techniques. In China, Buddhism encountered Confucianism and Taoism and had to adapt or die. It couldn't reject family and social duty like it had in India. That would never work in Confucian society. So Chan Buddhism, which became Zen in Japan, developed teachings that were compatible with Confucian ethics while maintaining Buddhist insights. It emphasized sudden enlightenment through meditation and paradoxical koans, but it didn't require abandoning social responsibilities. In Southeast Asia, Buddhism mixed with Hindu cosmology and local spirit worship, creating Theravada traditions that are distinctly different from their Indian origins. Temples became centers of community life. Monks became teachers and advisors. Buddhist festivals incorporated local agricultural celebrations and ancestor veneration. The same religion, spreading across thousands of miles but mutating, adapting, hybridizing with whatever it encountered. This is the genius of Eastern religious thought, this ability to synthesize rather than replace, to add layers rather than demolish and rebuild. Compare this with Christianity spreading through Europe. Christianity was exclusive in ways Buddhism never was. You couldn't be half Christian the way you could practice Buddhism while also honoring Confucian duties. Christianity demanded total commitment, absolute belief, rejection of other gods and other paths. This makes sense given Christianity's origins. It emerged from Judaism, itself a fiercely monotheistic religion that defined itself in opposition to the polytheistic cultures surrounding it. The Christian God wasn't one option among many. He was the only option, the only truth, the only path to salvation. As Christianity spread through the Roman Empire and beyond, it didn't synthesize with local religions the way Buddhism did in Asia. It replaced them. Pagan temples became churches. Local deities were recast as demons or saints. Traditional festivals were given Christian meanings. The old gods didn't coexist with the new god. They were driven underground or erased entirely. This created a very different kind of religious landscape. In China, someone could honor their ancestors, follow Confucian ethics, practice Taoist meditation, and visit Buddhist temples all without contradiction. In Christian Europe, you were Christian, or you were heretic. There was no middle ground. This difference shaped everything: law, governance, social structure, even concepts of individual identity. In societies shaped by ancestor worship, your obligations extended backward to the dead and forward to the unborn. You were a link in a chain stretching across generations. Your actions reflected on your ancestors and would impact your descendants. This created powerful incentives for social conformity and family loyalty. In monotheistic cultures, your primary obligation was to God, not to ancestors or descendants. This created a different kind of accountability, one focused on individual salvation rather than collective family honor. It made it possible, even necessary, to sometimes break with family and tradition if they conflicted with religious truth. These different religious frameworks created different relationships with nature too. The Genesis story in Christianity gives humans dominion over nature, the right and responsibility to subdue the earth and master it. Nature exists for human use. Animals and plants are resources, tools, things without souls or sacred significance. Eastern philosophies saw nature very differently. Taoism taught that humans were part of nature, not separate from or superior to it. The goal wasn't domination but harmony, finding your place in the natural order rather than imposing your will on it. Buddhism extended compassion to all sentient beings, seeing animals as participants in the same cycle of suffering and rebirth as humans. These weren't just abstract philosophical differences, they had practical consequences that echo into the present day. The Christian view of nature as a resource contributed to Europe's aggressive exploitation of natural resources and technological transformation of landscapes. The Taoist view contributed to Chinese landscape painting that celebrated natural beauty and garden design that harmonized human spaces with natural forms. And governance, law, the whole structure of society, it all flowed from these different ways of understanding the world. Greek philosophy, with its emphasis on individual reason and debate, created space for democracy and individual rights, however imperfectly realized. Confucian philosophy, with its emphasis on hierarchy and harmony, supported imperial systems where the emperor was seen as the father of the nation, responsible for maintaining cosmic and social order. Western law, influenced by Greek rationalism and Christian concepts of sin and redemption, focused on individual guilt and punishment. You broke the law, you faced consequences as an individual. Eastern law, influenced by Confucian ethics, focused more on restoring harmony, on mediating disputes to preserve relationships, rather than simply punishing wrongdoing. Even concepts of selfhood diverged. Western philosophy, following the Greeks, saw the self as a discrete entity with boundaries, rights, and individual consciousness. Eastern philosophy saw the self as relational, defined by connections to others, to nature, to the cosmos. The Western question was, who am I? The Eastern question was, where do I fit? None of this was predetermined by genetics or race. These were cultural adaptations, responses to different environments, different challenges, different historical experiences. But they became self-reinforcing. Philosophical traditions shaped governance, which shaped education, which reinforced philosophical traditions. Religious beliefs shaped family structure, which shaped economic organization, which reinforced religious beliefs. By the time these civilizations encountered each other in the age of exploration, they had been developing along separate philosophical and religious paths for thousands of years. They weren't just different cultures, they were different ways of being human, different answers to the fundamental questions of existence, and those differences would collide in ways nobody could have predicted. When those African descendants finally fanned out across Eurasia, they carried the same basic brain, the same instincts for cooperation and conflict. But as tens of thousands of years passed, as villages became cities and cities became empires, something subtle began to diverge, not in our DNA, in our rules, in how we decided who was in charge, what counted as justice, and why anyone should obey anyone else at all. To see how differently this could turn out, picture two worlds rising almost side by side. On one side, the Mediterranean. On the other, the Yellow River. In the west, Rome. In the east, Han China. Two empires, born of the same species facing the same basic problems. How to tax, how to fight, how to feed millions of people who had never met each other and never would. They solved those problems in strikingly different ways. Imagine Rome at its height. Roads like veins and arteries, stone and gravel connecting Britain to Syria, Spain to the Danube. A city fed by aqueducts, ruled from marble halls where senators argued in togas and emperors signed decrees. The Roman solution to power was a patchwork quilt. Conquer a people, let their local elites keep some authority, give them Roman law, Roman roads, Roman coins, promise citizenship, eventually. Pull them slowly into a shared legal and cultural world where Roman became less about blood and more about behaviour. You could be born in Spain or North Africa, speak Latin, serve in the legions, and end your days as a Roman senator. The empire was held together by law, by the army, and by a practical willingness to improvise. Now cross the continent in your mind. Stand on the walls of Chang'an, capital of the Han dynasty. Here, the answer to the problem of ruling millions was not a patchwork but a lattice, not accommodation but standardization. Weights, measures, coinage, writing, all unified. Empire here meant a single bureaucratic machine extending from the emperor's court down to the village headman. At each level, officials trained in the same classics, tested on the same moral and historical texts, speaking the same administrative language. If Rome was a network of contracts, Han China was a carefully tuned instrument. Yet both left deep fingerprints on the future. Rome's legacy in Europe was fragmentation wrapped in a memory of unity. When Rome fell in the West, its laws, its roads, its Latin language splintered into kingdoms and dialects, but the ghost of empire never quite left. Medieval rulers called themselves emperors. The church spoke Latin. Everyone remembered that once, long ago, there had been one world. Han China, by contrast, planted a different seed. Even when dynasties fell, the ideal of a single united realm under China never died. Peasants might change whose name they wrote on tax forms, but the idea that there should be one empire, not many equal states, remained. Two memories, two gravitational pulls. Europe would be drawn toward multiplicity. East Asia would be pulled, again and again, toward unity. You can see this if you pull back the map in your mind and let the centuries spin. In Europe, after Rome, no single power could hold the whole continent for long. Geography didn't help. The land was chopped up by mountain ranges, peninsulas, island chains, and navigable rivers pointing in all directions. It was a recipe for rivalry. Small kingdoms, city-states, duchies, principalities, always neighbours to compete with, copy, fear, or outdo. Italy alone housed Venice, Florence, the Papal States, Milan, Naples, each watching the others, borrowing techniques in war, banking, shipbuilding, art, and then trying to surpass them. In East Asia, especially in China, the geography told a softer, more centralizing story. The North China Plain, broad, relatively flat, tied together by the Yellow River and further south the Yangtze. Once someone built canals to connect those waters, grain could move from one end of the empire to the other, armies could float along those arteries, orders could travel downstream on paper and upstream in the mouths of officials who recited classics and bowed in the same direction. Yes, there were periods of disunity, the warring states, the three kingdoms, the southern and northern dynasties. But again and again, one state swallowed the rest, and China snapped back into one piece. So from the same human starting point, two patterns emerged. In Europe, permanent competition between medium-sized powers. In East Asia, long stretches of enormous empires, especially in the Chinese heartland. This difference in political rhythm shaped almost everything that came next. Consider feudalism, the basic logic of trading land for loyalty. In Europe after Rome's fall, power fractured downward. Imagine you're a king with only a small direct army and poor communication. You can't micromanage every village, so you give a piece of land to a noble, a lord, and in exchange he promises you soldiers when you call. He repeats the pattern, granting parts of his land to knights who owe him service. At the bottom, peasants work the fields, legally bound to the land, owing dues upward while protection flows, in theory, downward. The result is a pyramid of overlapping loyalties. A knight might owe service to more than one lord. Lords might quarrel among themselves. The king is more first among nobles than an absolute master. Japan, far to the east, created something that looked similar on the surface but grew from its own soil. There, rugged mountains and scattered fertile plains fostered powerful regional clans. The emperor remained a sacred figure in the background, a symbol of continuity. But real power, over time, coalesced around shoguns, military leaders who ruled in the emperor's name. Samurai warriors served these lords, the daimyo. They pledged not just service but devotion, guided by a code we now call bushido, an ethic of loyalty, honour and self-discipline. Unlike European knights, many samurai were literate bureaucrats as well as fighters, capable of both wielding a sword and keeping accounts. And while European feudalism gradually unravelled into centralised monarchies, Japan's feudal structures remained remarkably stable for centuries, until the shock of contact with industrial powers in the 19th century. Two feudal worlds, both trading land and status for military service, but one embedded in a continent of competing states, endlessly reshaped by war, trade and plague. The other anchored on islands insulated by sea, evolving in relative isolation. Beneath all this lay an even deeper question, one every society had to answer in its own way. Why does the ruler get to rule? In much of Europe, the answer hardened into something called the divine right of kings. The idea was simple and absolute. God himself had chosen the monarch. Obedience to the king was obedience to God. Resistance to the king was, at least in official theory, a sin. This didn't mean kings could do anything without consequence. Rebellions happened. But it framed power as a one-way gift from heaven, descending like a beam of light onto a single head. In China, a different theology of power emerged, the mandate of heaven. On the surface, it also linked rule to heaven, but the logic was more conditional, almost contractual. Heaven grants the mandate to a dynasty that governs justly, keeps order, prevents famine and chaos. If rulers become corrupt, cruel, or incompetent, heaven withdraws its support. How do you know the mandate has been lost? Disasters, rebellions. The land itself seems to convulse. When rebels overthrew a failing dynasty and a new one took power, official histories explained it not just as politics, but as the rightful shift of heaven's favour. This difference mattered. divine right tended to sacralize existing kings. It told subjects, this specific person, now, is chosen. The mandate of heaven sacralized good governance itself. It told subjects, a ruler is legitimate only as long as he rules well. In theory, a successful usurper who restored order could retroactively claim heaven's blessing. Underneath these sacred stories sat the day-to-day machinery that made rules real, bureaucracies. In medieval and early modern Europe, government offices were often filled by aristocrats, people who inherited their titles, wealth, and influence. Some were highly capable, others less so. Birth opened doors that education alone could not. Over time, especially after the Renaissance, Europe began to develop more formal training for administrators. Universities taught law, theology, and later economics and engineering. But the old habit of power tied to lineage lingered. China followed a different path. By the time of the Han Dynasty, and especially under later dynasties like the Tang and Song, a system of imperial examinations had begun to take shape. Over centuries, it hardened into one of the most elaborate merit-based bureaucracies in human history. Imagine being a young man in a small Chinese village, hundreds of years ago. If your family could spare the time and resources, you might spend your youth memorizing classics, histories, poems, moral treatises. If you passed local exams, you could sit for higher ones and, if you succeeded at the top level, earn a post as an official somewhere in the empire. In theory, your birth mattered less than your ability to master the texts and display the proper moral character. In practice, wealth helped, connections helped, and the system had flaws. But compared to Europe's inherited aristocracies, it was a striking experiment in selecting rulers by learning, not just lineage. This exam system helped China maintain a relatively unified culture of governance. Officials from distant provinces could meet in the capital and quote the same passages, appeal to the same histories, frame problems in the same moral vocabulary. Europe's aristocratic patchwork produced a different kind of diversity. Princes and ministers in France, England, Poland, and Venice often spoke different languages, followed different legal traditions, answered to different churches or none at all. Innovation in one place did not automatically spread. It had to be copied, stolen, or forced by war. And behind all of this still was geography. The wide, connected river systems and fertile basins of China made sustaining large centralized states feasible. Grain could be moved efficiently. Tax records could be collected and compared. A single imperial center could, with effort, keep an eye on distant corners. Europe's broken terrain, its mountains, peninsulas, and scattered coasts, made that kind of unified empire fragile. Attempts at giant empires like Charlemagne's, or later the Habsburgs, tended to shatter on the rocks of distance, local identities, and stubborn neighbours. These different political landscapes also shaped humanity's urge to experiment. In Europe, the constant competition between states acted like an evolutionary pressure on institutions and technology. If one kingdom developed a better canon, a more efficient tax system, a new banking practice, neighbours felt the pressure to respond. Fail to adapt, and you might be conquered, outtraded, or left behind. This created strong incentives for risky ventures. Funding a Genoese sailor to cross a seemingly endless ocean was dangerous, but if it worked, the rewards could catapult a small kingdom, like Portugal or Castile, into global prominence. If it failed, other states would try their luck. In China, a unified empire could, in theory, do much more than any single European kingdom. It could build vast fleets, dig monumental canals, field enormous armies. But it could also decide from the top to stop. In the early 1400s, the Ming dynasty sent out enormous treasure fleets under Admiral Zheng He, reaching as far as East Africa. They dwarfed contemporary European expeditions, but when court politics shifted and priorities turned inward, the voyages ended. There was no rival Chinese kingdom over the horizon to keep pushing exploration forward. The same centralization that allowed stability and large-scale projects also allowed a single decision to dampen certain kinds of innovation. So by the time Europeans and Asians met on a truly global scale, around 500 years ago, they were not different species, not different in basic intelligence or creativity. They were heirs to different experiments in how to structure power. Rome and Han, competing European states and long-lived Chinese dynasties, feudal knights and feudal samurai, divine right and mandate of heaven, aristocratic courts and exam-selected mandarins. Each system had strengths, each had weaknesses, each shaped how societies responded to new technologies, new trade routes, new threats, and above all, each rested on the same ancient foundation, the human need to cooperate in larger and larger groups to find stories that justify authority and to build institutions that outlast any single lifetime. The map of empires would change, borders would move, dynasties would rise and crumble, but the question, how should humans organize power, never went away. It simply took on new forms, in new ages, under new skies. Picture the world again, much later now. The ice has retreated, cities rise, kingdoms fall, oceans that once blocked your ancestors now carry their descendants in wooden hulls across the horizon. From far above, if you could watch the last 2,000 years as a time-lapse of light, you'd see clusters of brightness flickering in two great regions, one in the far west of Eurasia, and one in the east. Europe and East Asia, especially China, glowing with the heat of invention. They weren't inventing the same things in the same ways, but they weren't on completely different planets either. They were running the same race, on different tracks. Let's start in the East. In China, a series of breakthroughs would later be called the Four Great Inventions. They weren't just clever gadgets, they were civilizational force multipliers. The first was paper. Your ancestors in China learned how to turn plant fibers into thin, flexible sheets centuries before most Europeans had even heard of such a thing. Compared to papyrus or parchment, paper was cheap, light, and abundant. It changed who could write and what could be recorded. Tax records, poetry, military orders, philosophical treatises, all suddenly easier to store and copy. Knowledge stopped being something that lived only in the heads of scribes and became something that could be stacked in libraries. Then came printing. At first, carved wood blocks pressed onto paper, entire pages etched in reverse. Later, movable type. Not just one book painstakingly copied over months, but dozens, hundreds of copies, all nearly identical. The Chinese were printing texts centuries before Gutenberg was born. Buddhist sutras, Confucian classics, agricultural manuals. Imagine practical farming tips and statecraft guides spreading across a vast empire in ink and fibre. Next, gunpowder. At first, a curiosity of alchemists, a side effect of the search for immortality. Then, an explosion. Literally. Fireworks, signal flares, and eventually bombs, rockets, fire lances, crude ancestors of guns. You could project force at a distance in a way no spear or sword could match. And finally the compass. A small sliver of magnetized metal floating on water, pointing north as if it had an invisible string tied to the pole. With it, Chinese sailors could navigate in open water, out of sight of land, across cloudy nights and foggy mornings. It unlocked the sea in an entirely new way. Paper, printing, gunpowder, compass. 4 inventions born in East Asia, but destined to transform the entire Old World. They drifted. West slowly at first, carried along trade routes, copied, adapted, improved. And yet, when people speak of the scientific revolution, they usually don't talk about China. They talk about Europe, Galileo, Newton, Kepler, Descartes, Boyle. Why? It wasn't because Asians were less intelligent. The same bottleneck-forged brains, the same capacity for abstract thought, existed on both sides of Eurasia. The difference lay in how societies were structured and how knowledge was treated. In late imperial China, the state was powerful and relatively unified. For long stretches of history, one empire, one bureaucracy, one examination system. If you were a brilliant young scholar, your best path upward was to master the classics, pass the civil service exams, and join the administrative machine. Your job was to keep harmony, not overturn the intellectual order. In Europe, things were messier. Dozens of kingdoms, duchies, city-states. No single empire strong enough to impose one orthodoxy forever. If you annoyed one ruler, you might flee to another. If your ideas were banned in one region, you could print them in a different one. This fragmentation created something evolutionarily familiar: competition. Just as your distant ancestors had survived by spreading out into many small groups, European societies were divided into many small states. They fought, they traded, they spied on each other. They also tried to outdo each other in wealth, in weapons, in prestige, and eventually in science. When the scientific revolution began to ignite in the 16th and 17th centuries, it did so in an ecosystem that rewarded questioning and experiment in a new way. Universities, printing presses, merchant cities, and competing princes all played a part. A discovery in Italy could be challenged in France, refined in England, tested in the Netherlands. Ideas were not just preserved, they were attacked, defended, improved. This doesn't mean Asia had no science. Chinese and Islamic scholars made sophisticated advances in astronomy, mathematics, medicine, and engineering long before many Europeans did. But the specific European mix, fragmented states, relatively autonomous universities, a rising merchant class hungry for practical knowledge, and religious institutions that, despite conflicts, never fully shut down inquiry, created a feedback loop. Knowledge became a battlefield, and like any evolutionary arms race, that pressure produced rapid change. Printing magnified this difference. In both East and West, printing revolutionized how information moved. In China, woodblock printing allowed the central state and cultural elites to broadcast the classics, moral guides, and administrative texts across a huge territory. It helped unify language and thought, reinforcing a shared cultural canon. It was like a neural network wiring the empire together, but the signals mostly flowed one way, from the center out. In Europe, when Gutenberg adapted metal, movable type in the mid-1400s, something slightly different happened. Yes, Bibles were printed, but so were heretical tracts, scientific pamphlets, political screeds, satires, technical manuals. Pamphlets could attack kings, criticize popes, support or denounce reformers. There was no single stable center to fully control the presses. The result was intellectual turbulence, same basic technology, different information ecosystems. In one, printing stabilized tradition. In the other, it destabilized it. Metallurgy, weapons, and ships tell a similar story. In East Asia, especially under the Song and Ming dynasties, metalworking reached impressive heights. Cast iron, steel production, large-scale foundries. Chinese armies used early gunpowder weapons, metal armour, crossbows, siege engines. Massive wooden ships, the treasure fleets of Zheng He, sailed the Indian Ocean with advanced rudder systems and compartmentalized hulls that reduced the risk of sinking. For a time, Chinese naval technology was arguably ahead of anything Europe could field. In Europe, metallurgy evolved under different pressures. Constant warfare between neighbouring states meant every advantage on the battlefield mattered. Plate armour, improved steel for swords, then cannons powerful enough to shatter castle walls. The age of walled fortresses ended under the weight of cast bronze and iron artillery. Navies transformed from collections of armed merchantmen into purpose-built war machines. Ocean-going ships, caravels, galleons, ships of the line, were optimized for long-distance voyages and naval combat. By the 15th and 16th centuries, these ships were not just crossing the Mediterranean or hugging coastlines. They were circling Africa, reaching the Americas, linking oceans. European powers began projecting military force globally, using a combination of metallurgy, navigation with that borrowed compass, and emergent gunpowder artillery. Again, the raw cognitive hardware was the same. But political and economic context pushed each region's technology in slightly different directions. China built giant fleets, then decided the cost and risk weren't worth it, and turned inward. Europe, fragmented and hungry, kept pushing outward. Beneath all this ran quieter differences in how innovation and inventors were rewarded. In some East Asian empires, many of the most important innovations came from the state or were quickly absorbed by it. Skilled artisans could gain status and patronage, but the intellectual property itself wasn't something you owned as a private right in the modern sense. The highest prestige often belonged to those who mastered the classics, not those who tinkered with machines. In Europe, new rules slowly evolved. Early forms of patent systems appeared in Italian city-states and later in England and elsewhere. A patent was essentially a deal. Show us something new and useful, and the state grants you a temporary monopoly on its use. For a time, you get to profit from your idea. It wasn't a perfect system. It could be abused, but it changed incentives. Inventors, craftsmen, and entrepreneurs had a reason to bring their secrets into the open. Instead of hiding techniques within closed guilds, more and more knowledge spilled into public view and printed texts. Discovery could make you rich, not just respected. This shift in reward structures fed into what historians call the Great Divergence. For most of recorded history, China and parts of Europe were surprisingly similar in economic sophistication. Both had cities, markets, complex agriculture, advanced crafts. Around 1000 or 1200 CE, if you had to bet on which region would industrialize first, many observers would have chosen China. Its bureaucracy was efficient most of the time, its agricultural base was strong, its technology is impressive. But around the 18th and 19th centuries, something tilted. The Industrial Revolution began in parts of Europe, especially Britain. Steam engines, mechanized textile mills, coke-fueled ironworks, railways. Energy captured from fossil fuels and leveraged by machines multiplied human labour on a scale no previous society had achieved. Why not China? Why didn't the first steam engine appear in the Yangtze River Delta instead of in England? Scholars argue about this. Some point to abundant, easily accessible coal in Britain close to industrial centres. Others highlight Europe's intense interstate competition, pushing rulers to seek any advantage in revenue and war-making capacity. Some emphasise the way European legal and financial systems evolved. Joint stock companies, banks, insurance, and enforceable contracts that made large, risky investments possible. In China, the state was wary of anything that might disrupt social stability. Large-scale private industries that escaped bureaucratic control could look like threats. The empire was huge and at times relatively self-sufficient. There was less pressure to chase overseas colonies or radically new energy systems. Agricultural productivity per acre was already high, driven by intensive farming and crops like rice. The immediate need to replace human or animal labour with machines felt less acute. The Great Divergence wasn't a single decision or a single invention. It was the result of many small differences compounding over centuries, in geography, in politics, in institutions, in how knowledge flowed and who benefited from new ideas. Yet even as Europe pulled ahead in industrial power, the story of parallel innovation never vanished. Asian scientists and engineers adopted and adapted European technologies. European chemists built on earlier Islamic and Chinese knowledge. Telegraph lines, railroads, modern steel, electricity, and eventually computers and the internet knit the world back together into a single technological ecosystem. Underneath it all, the same bottleneck-forged brains were at work. The descendants of that tiny population 813,000 years ago, scattered across Europe and Asia, now reconnected by fibre optic cables and satellite links instead of stone tools and trade routes. Technology did not prove that one side was better than the other. It showed how deeply environment, institutions, and chance shape what a clever primate can do with fire, stone, and stories. Tonight, as you listen, the ships are steel, the printing presses are digital, and gunpowder's roar has become the distant hum of servers and satellites. But the pattern is familiar. Parallel paths, sometimes diverging, sometimes converging, always shaped by the same ancient engine. A species that survived the edge of extinction and then began to ask, what else can we make? What else can we know? And in the modern world, those paths begin to cross more than ever before. Now the world looks very different from the one where our story began. The ice sheets are gone, the mammoths are gone. But the descendants of those scattered bands in Africa, Europe, and Asia, they're still here. They just wear suits now, or saris, or jeans and sneakers. They type on glass screens instead of chipping stone. They ride in aluminum tubes through the sky instead of walking across land bridges of ice. And for the first time in our entire history, almost all of them are connected. For most of the last 10,000 years, Eurasia was a patchwork quilt of separate worlds. Chinese dynasties rising and falling in the east, Indian kingdoms trading across the monsoon seas, Persian empires guarding the crossroads, Greek city-states and Roman legions pushing west, steppe nomads riding between them all like ghosts, each region solving its own problems in its own way, guided by its own geography, its own crops, its own stories about what life meant. They knew about each other vaguely. Silk from China showed up in Roman markets, Persian coins found their way to Indian temples, Buddhist statues appeared in Central Asian caves. But contact was slow, fragile, and limited. Months on horseback, years for an idea to travel. Then, in a blink of historical time, something snapped. Ships left Europe and didn't come back with just spices and silk. They came back with maps, with plans, with a new idea. The world is one big board and we can move pieces on it. Colonialism took all those separate experiments in being human and slammed them together. European guns and germs exploded into the Americas, into Africa, into Asia. Ancient civilizations that had been evolving for thousands of years woke up to find foreign traders at their ports, foreign flags on their coasts, foreign laws creeping into their cities. If you were born in China, or India, or Japan, or the Ottoman Empire in the 18th or 19th century, you were living through a kind of controlled collision. Railways, telegraphs, steamships, machine guns, New religions, new political theories, they flooded in, layered on top of older systems of thought and power that had been shaped by rice paddies, monsoons, steppe invasions and silk routes. It wasn't a simple story of one side winning and another losing. It was something messier, a fusion, a forced remix. Traditional Asian bureaucracies met European industrial capitalism. Confucian exam systems collided with modern schools. Caste and clan met the printed constitution. Samurai swords faced rifles, and eventually factory assembly lines. Underneath all of this, the ancient patterns we talked about earlier were still there. The deep habits shaped by geography, climate, crops, and early states. How people thought about authority. How they defined family. How they imagined the good life. Colonialism didn't erase those patterns. It just put them under pressure. By the 20th century, the pressure boiled over. Empire, which had once looked eternal, began to crack. European powers that had ruled vast Asian territories started to look fragile. 2 world wars tore the old order to pieces. Japan industrialized at astonishing speed, beating Europe at its own game, defeating Russia in 1905. Building its own empire across East and Southeast Asia. China, after centuries of imperial rule and decades of humiliation, erupted into revolution. India, knitted together by British railways and bureaucracy, turned those tools around and used them to organize a mass independence movement. Old philosophies were reinterpreted in new ways. Confucian ideas about duty and hierarchy were bent into modern nationalism and socialism. Buddhist and Hindu concepts of suffering and liberation mixed with Western theories of democracy and human rights. Islamic scholars debated how revelation and modern science could coexist in a world carved up by foreign borders. World War II shattered what was left of European dominance. The United States and the Soviet Union emerged as superpowers. For a while, it looked like the story of humanity might become a duel between 2 industrial giants on opposite sides of Eurasia, with the rest of the world reduced to background. But under the surface, Asia was changing, quietly, relentlessly. In Japan, in South Korea, in Taiwan, small war-scarred nations poured their energy into education, manufacturing and technology. In China, after famine and turmoil, a series of reforms turned an enormous agrarian society into a workshop for the world. In India, a slow but steady transformation began, from a colony of cotton and tea to a democracy of coders and satellites. The power balance we had grown used to, modern Europe and America on one side, a traditional Asia on the other, started to flip. By the early 21st century, the numbers told the story. Asian economies surging, cities like Shanghai, Seoul, Singapore, Bangalore blazing with neon and glass, high-speed, trains crossing landscapes once travelled by camel and caravan, factories, research labs, universities, tech giants, all rising where rice paddies and palace walls once defined the skyline. But if you walk through those cities at night, the old world is still there. Under the skyscrapers you find neighbourhood shrines, street food recipes passed down for centuries, festivals timed to old lunar calendars, weddings that follow rules older than any nation-state. Modernity didn't erase the ancient patterns, it grew on top of them. China's long tradition of centralised bureaucracy still shapes how its modern state operates. India's complex patchwork of languages and castes still influences its politics. Japan's island geography and history of selective borrowing still colour how it adopts foreign ideas. Southeast Asia's old maritime trading networks live on in its role as a global shipping and manufacturing hub. Meanwhile, in Europe and North America, the story was also changing. immigration patterns shifted. Cities like London, Paris, New York, Toronto, Sydney became microcosms of the entire planet. You could walk a few blocks and hear Chinese, Hindi, Arabic, Swahili, Spanish and English mixing on the same street. The old East-West divide started to blur, not because differences disappeared, but because they began living side by side in the same neighbourhoods, the same workplaces, the same families. Globalization did something our ancestors never experienced. It turned the whole planet into a single tangled network. Not trade routes stretching across centuries, but fibre optic cables, satellites, undersea lines that move ideas in milliseconds. A teenager in Tokyo, Lagos, Sao Paulo, or Berlin can watch the same videos, listen to the same music, learn the same programming languages or conspiracy theories in the same afternoon. They can form friendships or rivalries with people on the other side of the world they will never meet in person. Cultures that once evolved in relative isolation now remix each other in real time. Sometimes this convergence looks like uniformity. The same brands, the same apps, the same coffee chains appearing everywhere. But underneath that surface gloss, the old differences still guide how new tools are used. The same social media platform can become a vehicle for individual self-expression in one country, for tightly coordinated political protest in another, for spreading religious teachings in a third, for comedy, gossip, or carefully curated silence somewhere else. Technology hasn't erased culture, it's given culture new channels to flow through. And as the cables and screens connected us, another revolution was quietly unfolding in the background. Not in politics, not in economics, in genetics. Remember those early humans splitting into different populations, adapting to different climates, meeting again and interbreeding. For centuries, people told themselves stories about races and civilizations as if they were separate branches on a tree. Science is now dismantling that picture. As geneticists sequence more genomes, from Europe, from East Asia, from South Asia, from the Americas, from Oceania, from Africa, the pattern becomes clearer. Humans are not neatly divided into biological races. We are a continuous interwoven web. Any two people chosen at random from anywhere on Earth are, on average, almost genetically identical. The small differences that do exist, skin colour, eye shape, lactose tolerance, resistance to certain diseases, are shallow adaptations to local environments, layered on top of a deeply shared toolkit. The genes that once helped some of our ancestors survive in snowy forests, or malaria-ridden swamps, or high mountain plateaus, have now been shuffled and spread by millennia of migration and intermarriage. Some Europeans carry Neanderthal variants that help with immune response. Some Tibetans carry Denisovan variants that help with oxygen at high altitudes. Some South Asians carry genetic traces from ancient steppe herders and early farmers from Iran. The labels we use today, European, Asian, African, are snapshots of culture and geography, not rigid biological categories. When we look at the DNA, the old walls dissolve. We see what we really are, descendants of the same tiny, desperate population that clung to survival through that ancient bottleneck. So why then do Europeans and Asians still feel so different? Why do their philosophies, their art, their politics, their everyday habits still diverge? Because culture can move much faster than genes, and it can also remember much longer. Thousands of years of rice farming versus wheat farming, of monsoon trading versus Mediterranean sailing, of steppe invasions versus ocean barriers, of emperors, shoguns, sultans, parliaments, and party committees. All of that has left deep grooves in how societies think and act. Those grooves don't vanish overnight because smartphones appear. They bend the way new technologies are used. They shape what people expect from their governments, from their families, from themselves. At the same time, those grooves are not cages, they're starting points. Humans are astonishingly adaptable. We can take tools invented in one context and twist them to our own purposes. We can blend philosophies that once seemed incompatible. We can create hybrid identities that would have baffled our ancestors. Chinese-Canadian software engineer, Nigerian-German musician, Japanese-Brazilian farmer, Indian-American Buddhist activist, each one a living bridge between once separate worlds. If you zoom out far enough, you can see a kind of spiral. Early humans leave Africa and diversify, adapting to different corners of Eurasia. For tens of thousands of years, those lines drift apart, creating distinct ways of being human. Then, over the last few centuries, ships and railways and telegraphs and planes and cables start to pull the lines back together. Not perfectly, not gently, but undeniably. We're now living in a moment where those long-separated experiments in humanity are converging. Ideas from European Enlightenment philosophy sit next to East Asian concepts of harmony and hierarchy. Indian notions of karma and rebirth travel alongside American individualism and consumer culture. Islamic ideas about community cross paths with secular humanism and scientific materialism. All of them jostling on the same screens, in the same cities, in the same minds. The differences between Europeans and Asians in language, in values, in politics, in everyday life are not signs that we evolved into fundamentally separate kinds of humans. They are signs of how flexible our shared mind can be. Given different climates, different crops, different neighbours, we write very different stories about what life should be. And now, in the modern world, those stories are meeting, arguing, blending and reshaping each other. As you lie here, listening, you are connected to all of it. Your phone, your headphones, your bed, your city, your language. They're all products of this long dance of divergence and convergence, of ancient bottlenecks and modern broadband, of Ice Age hunters and software engineers. The fact that Europeans and Asians ended up with such different histories and yet can talk to each other across the planet in real time tells us something profound about our species. We are not locked into one way of living, one way of thinking. We are capable of splitting into many paths, learning many lessons, and then bringing those lessons back together. The modern world, with all its tensions and misunderstandings, is also a vast ongoing experiment in what happens when thousands of years of separate evolution, biological, cultural, technological, are folded back into a single, shared story. And that story isn't finished yet. So now, lying here at the end of this long journey through time, you can start to see the pattern. Europeans and Asians didn't evolve differently because they were destined to be different. They diverged because the world pushed them in different directions, the same bottleneck, the same fused chromosome, the same raw material, but different landscapes, different climates, different neighbours. In the West, Ice Age plains, dense forests, and the shifting front lines between steppe and sea. In the East, monsoon belts, river megasystems, mountains that scrape the sky, island chains that never quite sit still. Each region laid down its own rules. Each one whispered its own quiet instructions into the genes and cultures of the people who lived there. Over tens of thousands of years, that meant different pressures. Different crops being tamed, different animals being domesticated, different paths for trade routes to snake across. In Europe, shorter growing seasons, harsher winters, and crowded frontiers nudged societies towards certain kinds of warfare, certain styles of fortification, certain political experiments in city-states and empires. In Asia, vast river valleys and monsoon rhythms favoured rice, or millet, or wheat, bureaucracies that could manage irrigation, Philosophies that thought in terms of harmony, balance and cycles, layer climate on top of geography, layer language families on top of trade routes, layer belief systems on top of all of that. You end up with very different ways of making sense of the same planet. But under those differences, the unity never goes away. The farmer chiseling terraces into a Chinese hillside 2,000 years ago, the shepherd guiding his flock through a cold European valley at the same time, both of them carried the same ancient genetic signature, the echo of those 1,280 survivors who refused to disappear. Their brains worked on the same operating system. They dreamed with the same neural wiring. They told stories around fires lit with the same ancient mastery of flame. What changed from place to place wasn't the species, it was the story. Europe told its story through sagas, cathedrals, parliaments, and printing presses. Asia told its story through epics, pagodas, imperial courts, and scholar bureaucrats. Different scripts written on the same page, different melodies played on the same instrument. When you look at the map now, glowing faintly in your mind as you drift towards sleep, city lights scattered across continents like constellations fallen to Earth, it's easy to see separation. Countries, borders, cultures, languages. Europe on one side of Eurasia, Asia on the other. But if you zoom out just a little farther, if you stretch time from days to millennia, the lines blur. You see migrations, not borders. You see trade routes, not walls. You see families moving, mixing, splitting and rejoining in an endless, slow dance. The question, why did Europeans and Asians evolve so differently, quietly dissolves into another question. How did one species find so many different ways to be human? And that question has a gentler answer. We adapted to where we were. We used the tools we had. We solved problems with whatever the land, the climate, and our imaginations gave us. Yet the core stayed the same. The urge to teach children, the need to belong to a group, the habit of telling stories late at night when the work is done and the fire is low. Right now, you're part of that same ancient pattern. Listening in the dark, letting your thoughts wander across continents and centuries. Maybe you're in a city apartment, the window glowing with distant streetlights. Maybe you're in a quiet village. Maybe you're somewhere in between. Wherever you are, you're invited into this shared story. If you'd like to keep travelling through time with me, you can gently tap like, so this story doesn't get lost in the algorithmic noise. You can subscribe so the next chapter finds its way back to you when you're ready to drift off again. And if you feel like sharing a small piece of your own journey, you can leave a comment telling me where you're listening from. A country, a city, a little corner of the world. It turns this channel into a tiny map of our species, a constellation of listeners scattered across the planet, all falling asleep to the same story. If you want to support these long, quiet explorations even more, you can also join the channel as a YouTube member. That's completely optional, never an obligation. The stories will always be here for you whether you join or not. But if you choose to, it helps keep the lights on, the research going, and the history flowing softly into your headphones. For now, you can let the details drift to the background. Ice sheets retreating, monsoons pulsing, fields being ploughed for the first time, cities rising, empires falling, books being written in scripts you may never read, and under all of it, one continuous thread of DNA, winding quietly from those early survivors to you. One species, many landscapes, many languages, many stories. As you close your eyes, you can imagine that ancient network of fires scattered across Africa, Europe and Asia, tiny circles of light in a vast dark world. People gathered close, watching sparks rise into the night, telling each other who they were, where they came from, and what might be waiting beyond the next river, the next mountain, the next horizon. Tonight, you join them. another human, breathing slowly in the dark, another mind, full of questions, another chapter in the same long story. Let the questions rest for now. Let the continents fade. Let the many paths of humanity fold back into one gentle, steady rhythm. Your own heartbeat, your own breathing, carrying you softly into sleep.